as I mentioned last week, I'm captivated by Genesis chapter 1, which proclaims that in the beginning, God created. Last week, we began at the very beginning and saw that Genesis 1 declares that God made it all you see and all you don't. And then the rest of the chapter elaborates on that. God made light and darkness, water and sky, seas and land. That was all God's work and not just some spontaneous process. And it was all created out of nothing. God always existed. Creation came into existence at a particular point. The universe was entirely God's invention, but nobody invented God. Now, when we get to verse 14, we get to the fourth burst of God's creative work, the making of sun and moon and stars. There are four things to notice here, and I have four words that start with P to guide our thinking. Some preachers do that all the time, but I would spend half my week poring through the dictionary, probably to no good use, and it would do you almost no good. Anyway, but once in a while, it all just falls into your laptop, and there it is. The first thing is that there's an interesting pattern here. When you stand back and appreciate the big picture of Genesis 1, you see that in the first 3 days, God formed things, places, and then on days 4 to 6, he filled those places with creatures. Forming and filling is the pattern of God's work. The sun was formed earlier on day 1, and now on day 4 it's filled with sun and moon and stars. Water was made earlier. Later it's going to be filled with fish. The land and the vegetation were made in the early going. Later the earth will be filled with animals of every kind, and then humans as well. The whole chapter is stylized like that. God formed something and then filled it with something else. It's designed like that. It was designed in a stylized way, in a kind of a poetic way, in order that it could be remembered over the centuries and then finally written down. And in order that you and I could have a vivid understanding of what had happened. Forming and filling. It's a wonderful pattern. But secondly, there's also a problem here. And it's the problem that adds the dash of controversy to today's message. At the beginning of creation, back in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But now here in verse 14, halfway through the process, apparently, God says, "Let there be lights." The sun to give light by day, the moon and the stars to illumine the night. That's odd, isn't it? First light and then lights? But surely it was the sun and the moon that provided light from the beginning? And how could there have been day and night without the creation of the sun? I think that this problem, and others like it that you'll notice as you read the book of Genesis, are indications that this account of creation is not meant to be a detailed scientific description. Instead, this chapter is a theological assertion that God created. It's meant to teach us things about God and the world, things that fall short, far short, in fact, of a scientific explanation. And that assertion, I think, is confirmed by the limited information that we receive here, by the various patterns we see in this chapter, including presenting the material in the form of 6 days, and in this forming, filling pattern that I described earlier. And although I know many fine Christians, including some of you, disagree with me on this, I think it's likely that the geologists and the archaeologists are... Does somebody mind getting me a glass of water? And by the way, they're going to edit this little bit out of the video. But I appreciate your prayers. Several of you have mentioned to me about the sound of my voice today. It's just an octave lower than usual. And I appreciate prayers for the preacher when that kind of thing happens. Interestingly, I was feeling a whole lot worse last Sunday when I sounded fine. And that, I think, illustrates the importance of praying every week for the preacher. And that, by extension, makes us realize we should be praying for each other all the time, not just when a big need seems obvious to us. Well, let me get back to Genesis. It seems likely to me that the geologists and archaeologists are right in saying that the earth is very old, and that the days of creation are symbolic of much longer periods of time. In fact, in some cases, even billions of years. As Moses himself said in Psalm 90, thanks so much, Kelly. That's more editing for the video people to do, right? As Moses himself said in Psalm 90, 1,000 years in your sight, O Lord, are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Now, I certainly believe that God could do everything in a week, and I believe that there could even be miraculous explanations for how there could be mornings and evenings before the sun was formed. But I think it's much more likely that many things, were made in the first moment of creation, while others were added ages later. That includes, I think, the special creation of human beings and a God-given soul made in the divine image. Now, it's important, I think, here that you don't misunderstand me. That I believe in taking the Bible literally. But taking the Bible literally means taking it on its face value, on what it intends to teach, on how it presents itself to us. It's very different to take a poem literally. I mean, to take a poem literally is to rejoice in the meanings, is to puzzle through the parallelisms and the figures of speech, and to be impacted by the emotions that are trying to be conveyed by that poetry. To examine an historical account, like many of the Old Testament passages that we read later on, is to look at, to understand something as history. Descriptions by eyewitnesses, perhaps, or people who heard from the eyewitnesses what had happened in space-time. But the events of chapter 1 in Genesis are not eyewitness testimony. There weren't even any people around to watch. It's inspired by God and presented in such a way that we understand, I think, possibly, that this is meant to teach us theological truths about what God made and that God indeed made. And so when the Bible uses a stylized pattern like these 6 days, we should interpret it as a pattern. And we should assert strongly what this pattern intends to teach. Namely, that creation is by God's word, that it's done in an orderly way, that everything there is came from God's hand. Genesis 1 wasn't meant to supply geological data or biological observations. It was meant to proclaim God created the world and everything in it, and he did it in a systematic, careful way. He made the sun and the moon, the sea and the dry land, the birds and the fish and the animals, the human beings, and all that he made was very good. And so this means that we have a message to many different groups. To the atheists, we say, we refuse to write God out of the story. To the evolutionists, we assert that God was involved in every detail of creation, supernaturally intervening at times in the natural processes that science investigates to create exactly what God wanted to be made. And with and to scientists generally, we stand confidently in the conviction that true science will support and not disprove the Bible. Let me just quote one more line from this book on 4 views on creation, evolution, and intelligent design. One of the authors, Hugh Ross, says, "The best interpretations of Scripture are not in conflict with scientific findings, and the practice of science arises naturally from a Christian worldview." That could be unpacked at length for sure, but maybe it's enough to say just now that all truth is God's truth. That God allows historians to investigate history. And we believe that if that goes forward on a basis of searching for truth, that the truth of history will be discovered. Or at least we'll know as much as God has allowed to be known. And the same thing goes for science. We have a confidence that as science works, as science is often guided by godly principles, in fact, as science grew out of godliness in its historical beginnings 400, 500, 600 years ago, we believe that science honestly pursued will bring scientific truth, God's truth, to light. And similarly, we believe that as we investigate the Bible, as we look into the Scriptures and work hard at understanding what it says, in all its diversity, in all its different forms and genres, we will understand the truth that God intends for us to hear there. Decisions like these, however, will mean rejecting some claims. It will mean that as historians and scientists and Christians, Bible scholars, people like you and me, work together to understand reality, we'll say yes to some things and no to some others. That means, I think, that world history is not just 6,000 years long, that the earth is not young, as some of these people would say, and some would disagree, of course, and that we would reject the idea that God would fool us into thinking that the rocks were old by placing fossils there so that we could be mistaken. To accept the timeline of geology and carbon dating doesn't mean that we accept the whole evolutionary process. To be open to modern science certainly doesn't mean that the world happened by accident. And in the end, it doesn't matter how long creation took, only the fundamental fact that God did it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. With that, let's move away from this problem and back to the text and choose another word that starts with P, polemic, to describe what the writer of Genesis is positively doing here. He has a bone to pick with the culture around him. He has a fundamental disagreement with the way people think in his culture. 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, when Moses or his followers put these words down, He's not only championing creation by the one true God, but he's also launching a polemic against the predominant worldview of people at that time. The Babylonians, for example, the dominant culture in the 2600s, 2700s, the 3000s, the Babylonians had their own creation story. And one of them was called Enuma Elish. And it said that the constellations were stations for the great gods. They believed that the sun and the moon were powerful deities, and that they influenced the weather and therefore the crops. And so the sun god needed to be prayed to and appeased. The moon god needed to be softened up and worshipped in order that this season's crops would work out well. But the Bible, Genesis, takes one look at that world around and says, no, there is only one God. And that God created the world and everything in it. There is only one God. And the gods of the sea and the sun and the moon are rejected. They're not real. Genesis pointedly says that God made the sun and the moon to give light on the earth. That's mentioned twice in verses 15 and 17. And it does it actually, take a look, without even mentioning the words sun or moon, just calls them the greater light and the lesser light. And that's probably because the Babylonians and others used the names of the sun and the moon to invoke the gods. Genesis didn't even want to use the names for fear of suggesting that there might be some reason to think that the sun and moon were powerful deities. How's that for a brief job description? That God made the sun and the moon to give light on the earth. God made the lights to give light. The earth's rotation gives people in every country their time in the sun every day. In the language of our text, God made sun and moon to separate the day and night, to mark holy seasons and days and years, to enable us to set out a calendar, to know when the important things, annual things were happening, to know when Passover and Pentecost, Christmas and Easter were happening. And so there's a polemical message here. The heavenly beings are not gods, and they don't control our lives, as the Babylonians and lots of others thought. There is no sun god. There are no weather deities, no powers in the sky that influence us. There is only one God, and he made the sun and the moon to give light. So why do so many people still believe in the power of the stars? Why do so many people read their horoscopes every day? A Gallup poll taken in this 21st century found that 25% of North Americans believe that the position of the stars and planets can affect people's lives. Millions more act like they're true believers. It's amazing that otherwise intelligent people can think they'll be lucky in love if they just find someone who's born under the right sign. And astrology is big business. Media outlets can't survive unless they provide this kind of information. Christians should know better, however, and have nothing to do with them. There's an older book. I've only ever seen one book on this particular subject. And it's written by someone who I met in Europe when we were there, a man named Charles Stromer. And I recommend the book that he wrote about horoscopes, which has some cheeky subtitle about those who dare to believe them or something like that. So, this anti-astrology, anti-sun and moon god, anti-superstition religion, message, is one of the parts of the Genesis 1 polemic. Finally, after the pattern, the problem, and the polemic comes a picture. This is the time when I'm hoping there might be a picture on the screen. There it is. The picture was released by NASA just last week actually. This big picture is of a nebula, the Lagoon Nebula, discovered by a young priest and astronomer, Giovanni Battista Odierna, a disciple of Galileo and a disciple of Jesus, almost 500 years ago. He was using a 20 times magnification telescope. Nothing in today's terms. But it got him close enough to this Lagoon Nebula that he noticed it as a significant smudge with a starry brightness in the center. And he named it Lagoon Nebula. Almost 500 years ago. Now the Hubble telescope has taken a close-up picture of it, which includes a relatively new star called, well, it was relatively new when they discovered it 500 years ago, too, of course. A relatively new star named Herschel 36. Except it only looks new to us because the light that we see coming from this star has traveled 4,000 light years to reach us. That's 40 quadrillion, 40 with 18 zeros, or I've lost track, might be 15 zeros. A lot of 40 quadrillion kilometers away. And so as we look up at the Laguna Nebula, we're seeing a picture of something from billions of years ago, because the light has taken that long to reach us, a long time to reach us. I'm not exactly sure how long. I didn't do that math. In Genesis 1:16, we're told very simply that God made two great lights, the greater one, the sun, to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night, that's the moon. And then comes that little sentence, he also made the stars. In fact, the original Hebrew is even simpler. Moses simply says, and the stars. It takes panache. There's another P word. You could just make a whole list. It takes stunning confidence and flair to speak of the stars that way. These huge boiling suns, gazillions of light years away, vast and virtually uncountable, those stars are God's creation too. And this brief phrase, this breathtaking understatement, with that breathtaking understatement, Genesis reminds us that God not only created all the things we see, the earth and the land, the birds and the trees, the whole list of Genesis chapter 1, and not just the star and the moon that we notice almost every day, but that God made the entire enormous universe as well. God made the sand and the salamanders, the tigers and the Tigris River, and God made the entire universe as well. So creation is amazing. Even though you and I might differ on some of the details about how to understand Genesis. In fact, enormously important details. I'm not making any light of that. Nevertheless, we agree that God's incredible beauty, from the stars so many kilometers away to the green growth that was growing in Hemlock Ravine as we walked yesterday, every single beautiful thing was made by our great God. Amen.